The Supreme Court just heard a gun case that could completely reshape where you are legally allowed to carry. And if you don't understand what just happened inside that courtroom, you could walk into a restaurant tomorrow and accidentally turn yourself into a criminal. Quick question before we continue. Are you subscribed? Because what I'm about to explain could literally keep you from facing a year in prison and a permanent criminal record. Hit that button now. Seriously, the information in this video is that important. Here's what just happened. On January 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States heard oral arguments in a case called Woolford versus Lopez. I know the name sounds technical, but stay with me, because this case is enormous. The state of Hawaii passed a law that essentially says you cannot bring your concealed carry firearm into any private business, any restaurant, any store, any commercial location, unless the owner clearly posts a sign saying firearms are allowed. Right now in Hawaii, even if you legally hold a concealed carry permit, you cannot walk into something as simple as a gas station with your firearm unless that business owner has specifically posted permission or directly told you it's allowed. If you do, you could face up to 1 year in prison. Now here's why this matters to you, even if you don't live in Hawaii. 4 other states have passed nearly identical laws: California, Maryland, New York, and New Jersey. That makes 5 states total where your concealed carry permit effectively stops working the moment you step onto private property that is open to the public. And here's the part that concerns many legal observers. Other states were watching Hawaii to see whether this approach would survive legal challenges. If the Supreme Court ultimately approves this type of law, many expect additional states to introduce similar restrictions within months. Let's walk through what this actually looks like in real life. Imagine you are a concealed carry permit holder living in Hawaii. You wake up, get ready for the day, and holster your legally licensed handgun like you normally do. On your way to work, you need gas. You pull into a station. There are no signs about firearms anywhere. Now what? Under Hawaii's law, you're supposed to leave your firearm in the car. But that creates another problem: security and theft risks. So maybe you decide to go inside and ask the clerk whether firearms are allowed. The clerk doesn't know. Now you're stuck making a decision that could carry legal consequences. Do you go inside? Do you leave the firearm unattended? Do you leave entirely? Now imagine the situation becomes even more complicated. You stop to buy groceries. You see no signage. You walk in, while legally carrying. Someone notices the outline of your holster under your clothing and calls the police. Officers arrive, and the store owner confirms they never granted permission. Technically, under the law, you could now be facing criminal charges, up to a year in jail, and potentially losing your firearm rights entirely. And all you did was walk into a grocery store while holding a valid permit. This situation is what many gun rights advocates have started calling the vampire rule. Why that name? Because, like the fictional rule about vampires needing an invitation to enter a home, this law requires explicit permission before entering private property while carrying. Critics argue that these laws were designed to make concealed carry so complicated and risky that people would simply stop carrying altogether. They describe it as an indirect restriction framed around property rights. So who is challenging this law, and why has it become such a major case? 3 residents from Maui, Jason Wolford, Allison Wolford, and Adam Kasparicki, along with a gun rights organization called the Hawaii Firearms Coalition, filed a lawsuit against the state. Their argument: the law violates the Second Amendment. The case first went to federal court, where the lower court agreed with the plaintiffs and blocked enforcement of the law. But the state appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and that's where the situation changed. The Ninth Circuit reversed the lower court decision and allowed the law to stand. Their reasoning relied heavily on historical examples. The court pointed to 2 older laws, one from New Jersey in 1771, involving hunting on private land, and another from Louisiana in 1865, that existed during the Reconstruction era. The second example drew immediate controversy because it originated from post-Civil War black codes, laws historically used to restrict firearm access for newly freed slaves. Critics of the ruling argue that using such historical examples raises serious constitutional and ethical questions. After the Ninth Circuit decision, the case moved to the Supreme Court, and this is where the story becomes even more significant. For the first time in a modern Second Amendment dispute of this type, the United States Department of Justice filed a friend of the court brief supporting the plaintiffs challenging Hawaii's law. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated that the Second Amendment should not be treated as a secondary constitutional right and emphasized that the department would continue defending constitutional protections. The DOJ's filing argued that Hawaii's law is unconstitutional and that states cannot bypass prior Supreme Court rulings through indirect restrictions. Specifically, the brief stated that requiring explicit permission from every private business effectively eliminates lawful public carry in practice. The department also raised concerns about scenarios involving firearms stored in vehicles, arguing that under certain interpretations, individuals could face criminal penalties even when a firearm is secured inside a car. Now, a quick legal note. This is educational information, not legal advice. Always consult a licensed attorney for guidance about your specific situation. Laws vary by state, and what applies in one jurisdiction may not apply in another. Do not make legal decisions based solely on a YouTube video. Speak with a qualified legal professional. But that wasn't the only support for the challenge to Hawaii's law. Montana Attorney General Austin Knudsen led a coalition of 26 states that also filed a legal brief supporting the plaintiffs. 26 states. That's more than half the country, arguing that this law is unconstitutional and creates serious legal confusion. The states included Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and even the Arizona State Legislature joined the effort. Their argument was direct and forceful. They said the Ninth Circuit's decision created a legal conflict across the country. Why? Because the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, which oversees cases involving New York, had already blocked a nearly identical law. Now, there were two federal appellate courts reaching opposite conclusions about the same type of regulation. That situation is known as a circuit split. And when a circuit split happens, the Supreme Court usually steps in to resolve the disagreement and establish one nationwide interpretation of the Constitution. That's exactly why this case moved forward. The coalition of states argued that the Supreme Court's 2022 ruling in the Brune decision was meant to clearly confirm that the Second Amendment protects the right to carry firearms in public for self-defense, not just inside the home. They said Hawaii's law attempts to weaken that ruling by making public carry nearly impossible in practice. To explain their position, the states compared the situation to historical resistance following the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, when some jurisdictions attempted to delay or avoid compliance. Their argument was that constitutional rulings must be applied directly, not bypassed through indirect methods. Now, the historical debate in this case is extremely important, so let's break it down. After the Brune decision in 2022, the Supreme Court established a new legal test for evaluating firearm regulations. Under that test, modern gun laws must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. In simple terms, courts must look at whether similar laws existed around the time the Second Amendment was written and adopted. If a modern restriction has no historical equivalent, courts are more likely to view it as unconstitutional. So Hawaii attempted to identify historical examples. First, the state pointed to an old 1771 law from New Jersey involving hunting restrictions on private land. But critics argued that this comparison does not match the modern situation. That law dealt with trespassing for hunting on land that was closed to the public, not businesses open to customers. That's a major legal distinction. Then Hawaii referenced an 1865 Louisiana law. However, this example immediately raised concerns because it came from Reconstruction-era black codes, laws historically used to restrict firearm access for newly freed African Americans. Opponents of Hawaii's law argued that such examples should not be considered valid historical precedent for modern constitutional interpretation. They said laws created with discriminatory intent cannot be used to justify modern regulations. So, what's really at stake here? If the Supreme Court ultimately supports Hawaii's approach, many analysts believe similar laws could expand into additional states. Several states, including Illinois, Washington, Oregon, and Connecticut, have already been closely monitoring the outcome of this case. If the court approves the framework, lawmakers in those states could move quickly to adopt comparable restrictions. That could mean that concealed carry permits become significantly more limited in certain regions, requiring explicit permission from businesses before entering while carrying. But if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs challenging the law, the outcome would send a very different message. It would indicate that states cannot use indirect regulatory strategies to eliminate the practical ability to exercise a constitutional right. In other words, the right to carry would need to remain meaningful in real-world situations, not just theoretical. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, imagine what you'll learn in the next video, where I explain the exact words many legal experts recommend using if a police officer asks whether you are carrying a firearm. Those few words can dramatically affect how an encounter unfolds. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. Now let's talk about what actually happened during the oral arguments. The justices asked difficult and very practical questions to both sides, focusing heavily on how this law would work in real-world situations. Justice Brett Kavanaugh asked Hawaii's attorney a key question: how many other states currently have this exact type of restriction? The answer was only 4 or 5. That detail appeared important because the court's current legal framework looks closely at historical and national traditions. If only a small number of states have adopted a law like this, it raises the question of whether it truly reflects a long-standing American legal tradition. Several of the conservative justices also focused on the practical consequences of the law. They asked scenarios such as, what happens if someone is legally transporting a firearm and briefly pulls into a private parking lot just to turn around? What happens if a person doesn't even realize the property is privately owned? What happens when the property belongs to a large corporation and there is no clear individual available to grant permission? These questions highlighted how complicated enforcement could become in everyday situations. Hawaii's legal team attempted to address these concerns by explaining that the law was primarily intended to apply to firearms carried directly on a person, not necessarily those stored inside a vehicle. They also argued that verbal permission from an employee could be sufficient. However, several justices continued pressing for clarification, suggesting there were still unresolved uncertainties about how consistently the law could be applied. Another major theme during the arguments was the broader constitutional principle involved. Supporters of the challenge argued that the case is not only about one state or one regulation, it is about whether constitutional rights can be indirectly limited through layered restrictions. To illustrate the concern, they offered a comparison. Imagine a law stating that freedom of speech exists, but people cannot speak on any private property open to the public, such as stores, restaurants, or malls, unless the property owner provides written permission first. Under that type of rule, everyday speech in public spaces would become extremely limited. The argument presented was that constitutional protections must remain functional in practical settings, not only exist in theory. The court is expected to issue its final decision by June 2026, which follows the court's typical timeline for major constitutional cases argued during the term. Based on the oral arguments and the number of supporting briefs filed, many legal analysts are closely watching how the court's current majority will interpret the historical framework established in recent Second Amendment rulings. In recent years, the court has issued several decisions expanding clarification around firearm regulations, including the 2022 Brune decision that reshaped how lower courts evaluate gun laws. However, until the ruling is released, the outcome remains uncertain. So what should people be doing right now? First, understand the current laws in your state. If you live in jurisdictions where restrictions involving private property already exist, it is important to carefully review how those laws are written and enforced. Do not assume that a concealed carry permit automatically allows entry into every location. Second, stay informed. Firearm laws continue to evolve quickly through both legislation and court rulings. What is legal today may change after new decisions are issued. So, third, many advocacy groups on both sides of the issue continue to follow these cases closely because constitutional litigation often takes years and involves multiple levels of appeal. Staying updated helps avoid confusion and potential legal risk. If you're finding this breakdown useful, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update, especially when the court releases its final ruling. The decision could immediately affect how concealed carry laws are interpreted across multiple states. This situation could change quickly once the final decision is released. Make sure you stay updated because the next ruling could directly impact where concealed carry is allowed and how existing permits are interpreted. Here's the bottom line. The court is deciding whether states can effectively restrict concealed carry by making it illegal to carry firearms on private property unless explicit permission is granted first. Supporters of the challenge argue that this approach violates constitutional protections. Supporters of the law argue that it reflects property rights and local authority. The outcome will affect millions of firearm owners across the country. If Hawaii's approach is upheld, similar laws could expand into additional states. If the law is struck down, it could significantly limit how far states can go when regulating concealed carry in public-facing private locations. Either way, this case represents one of the most closely watched Second Amendment disputes in recent years. Its impact could shape how firearm regulations are interpreted for years to come. And now you understand what's at stake. I spend hours every week researching these legal developments, reviewing court filings, and breaking down complex rulings so you can stay informed without having to read thousands of pages of legal material yourself. If you found this helpful, take a moment to hit the subscribe button to support the channel. And while you're there, turn on notifications so you'll know immediately when the final decision is released. Remember, this content is for educational purposes only. It is not legal advice. Every situation is different, and laws vary by state. If you have specific legal questions about your rights, consult a qualified attorney in your area. Do not rely solely on online videos when making legal decisions. Stay informed, stay responsible, stay safe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll cover what words you should never say during a traffic stop if you are carrying a firearm. Many people misunderstand this topic and end up creating legal problems for themselves. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Stay prepared. Stay legal. Stay legal. Stay informed.